Welcome to Going Deep. This is Angel Suarez, marriage and family therapist, limited permit from New York City, coming live at you now. Today we're going to be talking about a book by Kerner, PhD, licensed marriage and family therapist and sex therapist. His book, So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, Laying Bare and Learning to Repair Our Love Lives, from 2023, provides an in-depth look at all things sex. Ian Kerner's book can be for anyone. The person having issues in their relationship, for mental health professionals and also sex therapists, for the science geek that's really interested in learning about sex. This book has it all, from the most up-to-date research from sex therapists, scientists, and practitioners. Kerner uses everything from metaphors to diagrams to pictures to really support the reader understanding about their body and learning about new innovative techniques to have sex with their partners. Before we get into Ian Kerner's book and summarizing some of the main topics, we'll first begin talking about sex education, the risk reduction model, and also the erasure of pleasure, and how it connects to all the shame that we feel about sex. According to researchers Kerner and Lindbergh from 2022, in their study, they said that traditional public health goals for sex education in the United States have largely focused on helping young people really to avoid unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. This really makes me think about when I was in school, how all I learned was abstinence only and the scary parts about sex. Imagine how this really affects you as you develop sexually and you become intimate with other people. Kerner talks about what the heck happens in history, specifically mentioning about Christianity with Augustine of Hippo, the bishop who really focused on the condemnation of sex, which is what later leads on to the puritanical idea about sex in our culture. Kerner brings in quotes from the Old Testament, as well as how Augustine translates the original Adam and Eve story and creates this idea of obedience and lust. In my view, this is how religious belief devalues sexual pleasure and autonomy. Instead, religion promotes conforming to religious ideals and chastity. Our influence of religion on sex also connects to how we devalue sexual pleasure and instead focus on a traditional risk education instead of comprehensive sexuality education that centers sexual diversity, consent, healthy relationships, rights, empowerment, and sexual pleasure. Instead, at the center of politics and policy within sex education is the idea that we must protect our children from perverts, deviants, STIs, and the idea that children and youth can be autonomous in their thinking about sex and have desires. Ian Kerner talks about how this creates shame within people, such as having withdrawals, attack on oneself, avoidance, and attack on others. He goes in to talk about our childhood and how our families can support the shame model within us. Kerner says that the childhood environment which you have really affects either having shame or having pride when it comes to sex. Having an ideal environment that's a happy home where sexuality can be curious and fun, questions can be answered, allows a child to be prideful about their sex, versus an evasive environment or permissive environment or negative or overly sexual environment can create shame within a child regarding their sexuality. But it's through the work of Kristen Mark, Esther Corona Vargas, and Mariana Cruz that we know this is true. They say that positive experiences around sex and relationships in adolescence contribute to developing a healthy, intimate relationship throughout the individual's lifespan. Kerner talks about the different types of sex, such as intercourse versus outercourse. When he relates to intercourse with heterosexual people, he refers to it as PIV, which is penis and vagina intercourse. He mentions that there's 3 different types of categories of why we have sex, such as for procreation, relational, or recreational. But through his exploration of heterosexual relationships, really you begin to understand the difference between what men are feeling versus what women are feeling. While he explores the differences and the similarities between our genitalia, what really struck me was that he actually talked about the differences between our human sexual response that comes from Masters and Johnson's model. He demonstrates how their study from the human sexual response shows how women are able to have multiple orgasms, they plateau, and then continue back up to the orgasm stage, and then at the end they go to the resolution, which is different from men who go from excitement all the way to orgasm, straight down to resolution. And their plateau stage isn't the same as women's. It's Kerner's belief that the difference in this plateau stage is the problem for the orgasm gap. It's the discrepancy in the duration of the plateau periods that he states might be the heart at the pleasure gap. So while women are able to stay at the plateau stage for longer, the resolution stage for men happens immediately after their orgasm, which creates a wide variance of how the two sexes feel pleasure within their bodies. Jenny Higgins and Jennifer Hirsch talk about this in their article, The Pleasure Deficit. The study focuses really more about male pleasure as it relates to contraceptive and condoms. They state that studies have documented heterosexual men's lack of interest in using male condoms during vaginal sex because they diminish sexual pleasure. And so these studies have insight on how men's desires for sexual enjoyment actually shape their willingness to use male condoms. Kerner connects these ideas about how male pleasure is at the focus of sex between a heterosexual couple. This connects to his idea about the female body and the male body and the culture of what he calls ill clitoricity. He brings in the works of Freud to demonstrate how our society has gotten the idea about the clit wrong. Through his understanding of the differences between what men feel and what women feel during sex promotes the idea that what we think we know about the woman's body in society is not correct. He states that the glands of the penis is rife with sensitive nerve endings that are consistently stimulated during penetrative sex and thrusting, but it's the clitoris, not the interior of the vagina, that is similarly structured to the penile glands. Therefore, to him, the idea of out-of-course is just as important as the idea of intercourse because of the female body and its differences. It's also the idea of female expectations in society that interferes with good sex that results in bad orgasms. Kerner talks about a balance that's important and necessary when thinking about orgasms. From his first book, She Comes First, he suggests that there's more to sex than just the orgasm. It is this focus on the orgasm that makes women feel as if they should be grateful for men who express interest in their orgasms. It's this idea that sex is male-centric relating to the male orgasm. He states that findings in research demonstrate that investigators had really connected with the idea that was long suspected of how women's orgasms are at least partly serving an ego boost for men. But when women have more agency within sex, they have greater sexual satisfaction and excitement. This shows that women have much more of a need for their voice within the bedroom and not just relating to orgasm for the sake of a man. Through the studies of Rubin et al., it demonstrates that this idea of women supporting and prioritizing male pleasure is the script that heterosexual couples play out mostly. But this sexual script about orgasm and achieving orgasm doesn't only negatively affect just women. Kerner also states that it affects gay men as well as straight men, resulting in higher expectations, more letdowns, and then also focus on performance rather than experience. One way that Kerner suggests in order to combat this idea is the concept of entrainment, which is basically being in sync with one another, making sure that your rhythm is connecting with your partners. Through the use of entrainment training and advanced entrainment, you're not giving pleasure as much as taking pleasure from your partner in ways that you want. So Kerner states that the giver should aim to provide a persistent rhythm and allow the receiver to make adjustments to their pressure, friction of stimuli as needed. This is what I think is really important because at the end of the day, it's all about communication. So I think that the importance of understanding sexual boundaries within this entrainment can allow and strengthen body communication, recognizing your partner's wants and needs in order to support and strengthen their pleasure. He mentions many techniques that support heterosexual couples, such as the cord alignment technique, which is deep rhythmic thrusts that support missionary position, which really connects to the clitoral contact. In my view, I think this is what really connects people together by creating that connection. I think that would be hard to create in a one-night stand. So a question I have is I wonder how you create entrainment with someone you just meet or someone that is not friends with benefits. Throughout this chapter of the book, he provides other ways to create synchronicity between partners, such as kissing, dancing, and face-to-face conversation. While majority of Kerner's ideas focus on heterosexual relationships and penis into vagina sex, he provides an intersectional approach to sex by thinking about anal pleasure. Through his exploration around the G-spot, the P-spot, and the anus, Kerner is able to explore how a diverse way of thinking about the body can support anyone's exploration of pleasure. Within sex research, trans bodies and queer bodies have been kind of regulated to the side as the central focus and samples of subjects within sex research. Kerner makes sure that in his Cliteracy in Action, he's not just focusing on women, he's focusing on trans women, trans men, genderqueer individuals, lesbian women, and heterosexual women as having vaginas and vulvas. By him making sure to talk about the G-spot as much as he talks about the P-spot, he is equalizing the playing field for gendered and diverse bodies. But it is also this idea about anal play that creates possibility within the mundane. He actively goes against traditional ways of thinking about sex and creating new ideas for heterosexual relationships to explore. Throughout the book, he talks specifically about how to pleasure your bodies. And so with deep male arousal, he focuses on tapping, caressing, licking, flicking along the anus in a way that can open a man's physiosexual vulnerability. I'm pretty sure that is not how your grandpa thought about his anus. Kerner ends the book by providing a zoomed out look at how we actually focus on the stages of sex. He focuses on our inhibitors and exciters. Inhibitors are things that are environmental, situational, global, or systemic that really stop us from going on and continuing with being excited for sex. Exciters are exactly what you think about. These are things that turn us on. Within the stage of being turned on, there are three separate parts that are important to understand: embarkment, desire, and arousal. Kerner talks about embarkment as being the willingness or motivation or reasons that make us want to be responsive or have spontaneous desire. Spontaneous desire is having the urge and excitement of just going in there, versus response is us actually responding to someone's cue, which then leads to arousal. The first type of arousal is at the warming up or cultivating, such as above the waist stimulation, such as sensual touching or kissing or facial touching, having psychogenic stimulation, such as face-to-face or side-by-side. The second type of arousal, with continuing turning on, is deepening arousal above the waist and neck. Also below the waist, such as outer course activities such as oral stimulation or manual stimulation. And then after arousal in this framework is plateau and then orgasm, which is directly derived from Masters and Johnson's human sexual response. Kerner adds one more thing at the end, which is aftercare, focusing on connecting to the self, to the partner, or returning to the pre-arousal stage. It is through this final framework that he gets people to understand what is their sex script, how do they make meaning in that sex script, and how do they change things in order to make sure that they're connecting in their relationship. At the end of the book, Kerner provides resources and exercises for couples to be able to try out and connect on different levels. I think this book is really good at understanding about our human body and then also taking an introspective look at where we are within this framework in the sexual stages. And of course, I'm going to say, going deep. Thank you for listening. This is Angel signing off. Have a good night.